You ever look at the tag on your shirt and think, how is this still made in China? I mean, we say we care about buying American. In fact, in a recent survey, 82% of Americans said they would prefer to buy products made in the US. That's a powerful statement, a reflection of pride, values, maybe even nostalgia. But then here's the reality check. Over 40% of the clothes sold in America today still come from China. That's not counting Vietnam, Bangladesh, or India, just China alone. So what gives? We like the idea of made in USA. It sounds right, it feels good. But when we're actually standing in the store, when we open that browser tab and see two t-shirts, one made locally for $40 and one imported for $9.99, well, the choice gets complicated, doesn't it? And yet, there's something deeper here than just price tags and patriotism, because behind every shirt we wear is a story of how entire industries moved on overseas, how machines couldn't fully replace people, and how even today America struggles to make a simple cotton t-shirt on its own. In this video, I want to take you on a journey, not just through supply chains and factories, but through decisions that shape the world we live in. And maybe by the end, we'll have a better answer to the question, why are your clothes still made in China? And what would it take to bring them back home? Let me ask you something. Do you remember when Levi's jeans were proudly made in America? Not just designed here, but stitched, dyed, and finished on US soil. That's not just a piece of denim nostalgia. That was real, and it changed fast. Let's rewind to the early 1980s. At that time, the US still had a strong textile and garment industry. Levi's alone operated over 60 factories across the country. You could find sewing floors humming in places like Texas, Arkansas, and North Carolina. But by the mid-1990s, something dramatic started to happen. Trade policies shifted, globalization picked up speed, and countries like China, with cheaper labor and fewer regulations, began rising as manufacturing powerhouses. One major turning point, NAFTA, signed in 1994. It opened trade between the US, Mexico, and Canada, with the goal of creating more economic opportunity. But for many US workers, especially in textiles, it meant competition with lower-wage factories just across the border. Jobs started disappearing. Then came China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. That was a game changer. It gave China direct access to global markets with lower tariffs and fewer barriers. Almost overnight, Chinese factories became the go-to for everything, from electronics to socks. Between 2001 and 2010, over 750,000 US textile and apparel jobs vanished. And companies like Levi's? They couldn't compete. One by one, they shuttered their American factories. By 2004, Levi's had closed its last US sewing plant, a symbol of American grit, gone offshore. And here's the thing, it wasn't just about costs. Yes, wages were dramatically lower in China, but so were environmental standards, worker protections, and production timelines. It became hard not to move production overseas if you wanted to stay in business. Now, as someone who grew up seeing those made in USA tags, I'll admit it stings. Not because I'm against trade, but because somewhere along the line, we stopped thinking about the long-term cost of saving a few bucks. We gained cheaper clothes, but lost entire communities. And honestly, it's easy to blame corporations, but we also have to look inward. We love the idea of local, but when it's time to click buy, do we vote with our wallets? Coming up next, let's dig deeper into why cost became the king. Because even if you want to buy American, the numbers don't always make it easy. Let's talk about the price tag. Here's something we don't like to admit, and yet it hits home every time we shop. We say we want made in USA, but when we're standing in Target and one pair of socks is $6 and the other is $14, most of us quietly reach for the $6. Why does this happen? Why does price so often win over patriotism? Well, part of it comes down to human behavior, not just economics. We're wired to seek value. And over decades, we've been trained, conditioned really, to associate value with low prices. That's where price elasticity comes in. It's the idea that when prices go up, demand goes down, especially when it comes to everyday essentials like clothing. Unlike luxury goods, a t-shirt doesn't usually carry emotional prestige. So if one costs twice as much, most consumers just won't bite. But it's not just about saving money. It's about habits, deep, unconscious patterns. For years, brands like Walmart and Amazon have shaped how we shop. They've made low prices feel normal, expected, and they've made convenience addictive. Think about it. You're online, it's 10 p.m., you need a new hoodie. Amazon delivers in 2 days, cheaper than the small US-based brand you saw on Instagram. You don't even think twice. It's not just a purchase, it's muscle memory. And I'm not saying this with judgment. I've done it too. We're all juggling budgets, families, work. Life is complicated. But here's the rub. These small decisions, made millions of times every day, shape the entire global supply chain. That disconnect between our values and our behavior is where real change gets stuck. A survey might show that 82% of Americans want locally made goods. But what we do often doesn't match what we say. It's also worth noting, made in USA is not just about pride. It often means better wages, stricter environmental regulations, and more ethical labor. But those benefits come with a cost, literally. And we haven't built a system that helps consumers shoulder that cost easily. Personally, I think this is where education and transparency can make a difference. When we understand the ripple effect of our purchases, we start to pause. We start to ask, what am I really paying for? And maybe that pause is where change begins. Now let's pull back the curtain on another layer of this story, something even most shoppers don't know. Because even if you're ready to support American-made, it turns out there's a hidden obstacle. Let's talk about the hidden gap in the supply chain. Let me ask you something that might surprise you. What does a 100 Nike sneaker really cost to make? Not what you paid at the store, not the price you saw online, but the actual cost. Materials, labor, shipping, the whole deal. Here's the kicker. That 100 shoe, it probably cost Nike around $20 to $30 to manufacture. Yeah, that's it. Let's break it down. Say you're holding a $100 sneaker. Around $12 to $15 goes to materials, rubber, foam, fabric. Then you've got factory labor, maybe $2 to it if it's made in Vietnam or China. Shipping and logistics, add another $2 to $4. What about the rest? Well, it's split between marketing, retail markup, corporate overhead, and profit margins. By the time it hits a Foot Locker shelf, the retailer needs to make their cut too. Now imagine making that same shoe in the United States. The material cost might stay similar, but factory labor, that jumps from $2, $3 to $15, $20 or more per pair. And that's just wages. It doesn't include things like insurance, compliance costs, or benefits. The result? Your 100 sneaker suddenly becomes a 150 plus sneaker, just to keep the same profit margins. And here's the problem. Most customers won't accept that. We've been trained to expect that shoes, even branded ones, just shouldn't cost more than $100, so American-made versions often fail to compete. Not because they aren't better, but because they aren't cheap. And let's be honest, we don't see this breakdown at the point of purchase. There's no label that says, hey, this $3 wage helped keep the cost low, but it also means someone worked a 12-hour shift in poor conditions. As consumers, we're often shielded from the true anatomy of a product, so it's easy to ignore the human cost. Not out of malice, but simply because we don't have the full picture. Personally, when I learned these numbers, it made me pause. It reminded me that the story behind our stuff is often invisible. But invisible doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And I think deep down, most people want to buy better. We just need to see what better really looks like. So let's go deeper, because even if a consumer wants to choose made in USA, there's a bottleneck. Let's talk about the factories that no longer exist and the massive gaps in our supply chain that no amount of patriotism can fix overnight. What if I told you that robots were supposed to bring shoe manufacturing back to America? Not a dream, a real plan. Companies like Nike and Adidas poured millions into automation projects, hoping machines could make sneakers as cheaply as overseas factories. But here's the twist. It didn't work. Let's start with Nike. Back in the 2010s, Nike partnered with Flextronics in Mexico to create a fully automated shoe production line. The goal was ambitious: cut labor costs, reduce turnaround time, and bring manufacturing closer to the U.S. market. But what happened? The robotics struggled with the complexity of materials. Shoes, it turns out, aren't like assembling an iPhone. You're dealing with soft fabrics, flexible foam, uneven stitching, things that are surprisingly hard for a robot to handle with the precision and flexibility of a human hand. So the project fizzled out. It wasn't a failure in technology. It was a mismatch between what robots can do and what shoemaking requires. Then came Adidas. Their Speed factory in Germany, and later Atlanta, was hailed as the future. It used automation to quickly produce shoes tailored to regional markets. It was clean, fast, efficient, and it shut down in 2020. Because even though the tech worked, it couldn't match the cost efficiency of Asian suppliers. Adidas quietly moved production back to Asia, where labor was still cheaper and more scalable. So what does this tell us? Automation is promising, yes, but there's a gap between technical feasibility, what's possible in a lab, and economic viability. What makes sense in the real world? I think that's something many of us forget. Just because we can build a robot doesn't mean it's worth the investment, especially when a $3 an hour worker can do the same job, faster, and with fewer errors. It's a hard truth. And as someone who believes in innovation, it's frustrating to admit. But I've come to respect the nuance here. Automation isn't a magic wand, it's a tool. And like any tool, it has limits. Until we reach the point where robotic dexterity and learning catch up to the intricate needs of textile work, cheap labor will still dominate. So if we can't rely on tech to fix the offshoring problem, what can we do? Maybe the answer isn't in machines, maybe it's in rethinking our supply chain altogether. Let's explore how reshoring could actually work, and why it's not just about bringing jobs back, but rebuilding entire ecosystems. Here's something most people don't realize. Even if you wanted to make a shirt entirely in the US, you probably couldn't. Not because we don't have sewing machines or skilled labor, but because we don't make buttons or zippers or the right kind of thread, or even the bulk fabrics anymore. That's what economists call a hollowed-out supply chain. When we offshored garment production decades ago, we didn't just lose factory jobs. We dismantled an entire web of supporting industries that made those jobs possible. Let's say you want to reopen a shirt factory in North Carolina. Sounds patriotic, right? But you'll soon find out your cotton might still come from Texas. But it has to be woven into fabric in China, dyed in Vietnam, and shipped back across the Pacific before you can cut and sew it. That's not just inefficient, it's economically impossible to compete with countries that have full end-to-end ecosystems. In Vietnam or China, a clothing manufacturer can walk across the street to source buttons, zippers, threads, even dye chemicals. They don't need to wait weeks for a shipment to arrive. They don't need to pay 5 different companies in 3 different countries. They have scale, and scale is everything. This is where many reshoring dreams hit a wall. You can't just bring back the final step of making clothing and call it made in the USA. If you're still importing 80% of the components, the cost stays high and the vulnerability remains. We saw this clearly during the pandemic. Factories in the US that tried to make masks or gowns were stalled because they couldn't get the right elastic bands or non-woven materials. That wasn't just a COVID story, it's a warning sign for the future. So here's where I stand. If we're serious about rebuilding American manufacturing, we need to rebuild networks, not just buildings. We need investments, not just in flagship factories, but in all the small, often invisible parts of the process that keep the system running. And it's going to take time, but it's also an opportunity. There's a real chance to bring back not just jobs, but resilience. a sense of control over the essentials. Because if we can't even make a shirt without calling 5 countries, what happens the next time the world shuts down? That's why in the next section, we'll talk about what it really takes to make Made in the USA viable, and whether we're finally ready to pay the price for independence. Here's the hard truth. Bringing manufacturing back to the US sounds great until you see the bill. And I mean that quite literally. Reshoring garment production isn't just a patriotic idea, it's an expensive one. We're talking about costs that are often 3 to 4 times higher than making the same product overseas. A t-shirt that costs $5 to make in Bangladesh might cost $15 or $20 here, and that cost doesn't magically disappear. Someone has to pay it, either the company, the consumer, or the government. Let's be honest, for most companies, profit is oxygen. If they can make something cheaper abroad and consumers keep buying, there's little incentive to switch. But there are moments when reshoring does make sense, especially for industries tied to national security or public health. During COVID-19, we learned the hard way how fragile our supply chains are. Suddenly, making face masks or antibiotics in the US didn't seem like an unnecessary expense. It seemed like a lifeline. That's why pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and defense gear are often first in line for reshoring efforts. Still, even in those industries, change doesn't happen without help. That's where policy steps in. Tools like the Buy American Act, tariffs on imported goods, or federal subsidies can help level the playing field. They send a message. If you're willing to build here, we'll back you. But we have to be careful not to oversimplify. Tariffs can raise prices for everyone. Subsidies cost taxpayers. And reshoring isn't just about money, it's about values. Many Americans are willing to pay a bit more for goods made under fair labor conditions or with better environmental oversight. But how much more? Is that extra third on a jacket worth it, if it means cleaner factories and safer working conditions? That's a question each of us answers with our wallet. And one more thing, sometimes we focus too much on price tags and forget the hidden costs of overseas production. Factories in countries with weak labor laws often exploit workers. Environmental regulations are lax, leading to pollution we'd never tolerate at home. So yes, reshoring may be expensive on paper, but offshoring comes with costs we don't always see. Personally, I believe in smart reshoring, not a blanket return to the past, but a thoughtful approach to building resilience where it matters most. And that brings us to our final piece of the puzzle. If reshoring is complex and costly, how do we move forward? What can we as everyday consumers actually do about it? So let's recap everything we've covered today. We've walked through the real cost of cheap clothing, the psychological tug-of-war between patriotism and price, and the complex realities of reshoring. It's clear that bringing manufacturing back to the US isn't as simple as slapping a Made in USA label on a product. The costs are higher, the supply chains are fragmented, and it's not just about economics, it's about values too. Now, I want to ask you something. Would you be willing to pay double for clothing made in the USA? It's not just a hypothetical. We're facing a real crossroads in how we balance affordability and local production. If we also start demanding more sustainable, ethical, and locally made products, we may start seeing a shift in the market. But it's not as simple as flipping a switch. Hybrid models could be a smart way forward. Imagine clothes designed locally but assembled offshore, leveraging the strengths of both systems. This could allow us to support local designers and create jobs without the skyrocketing prices of full-on reshoring. But the real question is, what do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you support a model like this, or do you think we should go all in on reshoring? If you found this video insightful, share it with a friend who might also be interested in these global economic challenges. And if you want more deep dives like this on supply chains, economics, and the forces shaping the world around us, don't forget to subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll be diving into more of these topics in future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.